and welcome back to the Van Maren Show on LifeSiteNews.com. My name is Jonathan Van Maren, and today I want to do something a little bit different than we usually do on the show. We often examine social issues. We do a deep dive into abortion culture. We take a look at the trans phenomenon from the perspective of authors, researchers, survivors of the lifestyle. But today I want to talk to Christopher Ruffo, who is the director of the Discovery Institute's Center on Wealth and Poverty. There's been a lot of discussion over the last several years on how Trump won in 2016. A look at the voters that turned out in the Rust Belt, that turned up in these lost American cities and voted for change, voted for Trump because essentially they were desperate. They felt like nobody was listening to their concerns, and they badly needed somebody to be their voice in Washington, D.C. J.D. Vance's magnificent memoir, Hillbilly Elegy, which examines his life in the Rust Belt, is one book that's been sort of vaunted as an explanation for why so many voters turned out. And Christopher Ruffo's latest film, America Lost, which tells the story of three forgotten American cities, does an even deeper dive than Hillbilly Elegy, because he takes a look at the conditions that created this crushing poverty. And the film, which I watched several weeks ago, is really, really moving because the scenes that you see in these cities in, Youngstown, Ohio, and parts of Memphis, Tennessee, and Stockton, California, some of these scenes look like 1945 Berlin, or they look like, Aleppo after the Civil War in Syria had ravaged it. And this is the United States of America in the year 2020. And the people who live among the ruins, the rates of family breakdown are staggering: homelessness, poverty, addiction, crime. These things are not very well understood, but they do need to be understood. So this documentary profoundly moved me. I wrote a review of it for the American Conservative, and I think that going forward, conservatives, and especially social conservatives, need to do a better job of understanding the conditions that so many fellow citizens live in and look towards creating policies that actually address their issues, that address their lived experiences on the ground, especially when we look at family breakdown. I wrote another column recently for the American Conservative, on the realignment, the potential for an alignment between social conservative policies and a more family-oriented economic policies that can start to address some of these problems and potentially create a new base that the Republican Party can work towards. I've talked about that a lot on this show with people like Mary Eberstadt. We've talked a lot about the policies that are being implemented in Hungary and other countries. And I thought that Christopher Ruffo's documentary, America Lost, which aired on PBS, he's directed 4 documentaries for PBS, Netflix, and other international television stations, really helped me understand what it is that's actually taking place. And understanding the problem on the ground in a real way, I think, is the first step towards realizing what we in social conservative circles can really do about this. So Christopher Ruffo agreed to come on the program. He's a magna cum laude graduate of Georgetown University. He's a Claremont Institute Lincoln Fellow. He's appeared on NPR, CNN, ABC, CBS, HLN, and Fox News. And now he's come on the Van Maren Show to explain what he saw, explain his experiences, and explain the conclusions that he's reached as a result of directing his latest film, America Lost. This is that conversation, and I hope you find it as enlightening as I did. So I guess start off by sharing a little bit with the listeners about yourself and your work.
Yeah, I'm Christopher Ruffo. I am a writer and filmmaker. I cover social and political topics, and for the last few years, I've focused on poverty, homelessness, addiction, mental illness, and progressivism and critical race theory.
There's a lot there. What sort of work are you doing on critical race theory, as a side note?
Yeah, I did a series of investigative reports over the summer where I was kind of exposing and documenting critical race theory trainings in federal agencies. And I worked on a report of these stories. I had a feature segment on Tucker Carlson, and then the president saw it and issued an executive order banning these trainings from the federal government. So it was a very exciting summer project that I worked on.
Yeah, not everybody's summer projects end with an executive order from the President of the United States.
I know. Certainly mine haven't. So yeah, I don't know if I'll be able to replicate it now, seeing how the election goes. But it was a lot of fun, and I think it ties into my other work more broadly on poverty and those kind of cluster of issues. So it was really kind of a great lesson in how do elites think about poverty and race and class, and then how do those issues of poverty, race, and class actually play out in real life, which I captured in my film.
Yeah, so let's talk about the film because one of the things I found fascinating about it was when I started watching it, I was prepared to see a lot of shocking imagery. I was prepared to get sort of some boilerplate solutions at the end of the film, explaining how money here or money there, was going to fix this problem. A sort of a recasting of Lyndon B. Johnson's War on Poverty. But I got something a lot different, right? You go through three major cities. And just maybe start off by telling us what you found when you went to those cities and the history that you explored. Like, how did these cities go from boom towns to the ghost towns that you show in your film?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think I approached the film probably with a lot of the same kind of mindset and background ideas as you did watching it. And I really kind of, as I was setting out at the beginning to go to these cities, to find the cities, to kind of figure out how to conceptualize the film, I thought my assumption was that these are predominantly economic problems and public policy problems, both what got these cities into trouble, what led to their decline, and also what solutions, could take them out of these kind of really deeply kind of destructive cycles of poverty. And after I spent months and then, a year, I realized that I had it at this point kind of all wrong, that the economic and public policy questions at this point are really secondary. They're almost surface level. And the actual poverty that you see in the film that affects people in real life is much deeper than that. It's social, it's cultural, it's personal, it's spiritual. It's really kind of deeply embedded in everyday life, not simply just the economic realm or the public policy realm. And there's a lot of debate, right? The question you asked is what got these cities into trouble? And we seem to be stuck there. And there's a lot of good answers. And I think that, it could be everything from the kind of process of creative destruction and how industries change and lose competitiveness. It could be kind of democratic machine, labor union run cities that fall into a cycle of corruption and political incompetence. It could be the free trade agreements that kind of outsourced a lot of the key industries in these cities. It could be overregulation. I mean, it could be, there's a lot of plausible left and right-wing explanations. And I think there's some truth to all of them, frankly, having spent a lot of time there. I don't think it's just one thing led Youngstown or Stockton or Memphis into decline. But I think the problem is that we spend so much time debating what happened 40 years ago that we don't actually really think what is the reality now. And so I really switched focus to thinking less, what happened and engaging in that kind of stale debate, and more trying to say, what is the phenomenology of poverty right now? How do people experience it? How does it hold people back? How does it manifest itself in daily life?
And so what did you find on that score?
I mean, obviously economics is a huge part of it, right? I don't mean to discount that. Obviously, poverty, the kind of shorthand for poverty is a kind of economic threshold. So the economics matters. And certainly people, especially in a place like Youngstown, where they lost kind of catastrophic loss of industry, those stories still matter to people. But I think what I found is that, 30 years later, 30 years after the kind of collapse or crumbling of these cities, of especially kind of lower levels of education, employment. 30 years later, it's really kind of burrowed itself into the social institutions. And that, I think, is really the most important insight in the film, most important content or material in the film, is that you have kind of, I think most acutely, this this collapse of family. And this is something that mostly people on the right have documented, but I think we've almost underestimated the power of that. And you have communities that have, thousands of residents in a zip code, 6 to 10,000 residents, where there are only a handful of traditional two-parent households. And this is really like a new social order. It's something that people were concerned about in the 1960s when the kind of rate of single-parent households in certain demographics was about 25%. Now in certain neighborhoods of all three kind of dominant racial groups in the United States, where it's at virtually 100%.
Yeah.
So I think that's a tremendous thing. And then I think you look at the kind of knock-on consequences of kind of the stripping of the social safety net, the loss of faith communities, the loss of other forms of kind of social organization. And you get this really kind of brutal world of the black market, of crime, of addiction, and death. And that's something that I saw over and over that really hammered away at these places. And I think there's really no reason that kind of lower class communities have to be this way. It wasn't that way in the past. It's not that way in other countries where the actual kind of income is even much lower than it is in the United States. So I don't believe that it's inevitable that, that lower class is kind of synonymous with violence, addiction, and destruction and family breakdown. I think that it's happening for a reason that we have to uncover and we have to try to reverse. And we have to look, to other examples where it's not the case, where actually being on the lower end of the income scale doesn't strip you of your basic dignity. And that to me is really the most important question. The most important question isn't, how can we get, Youngstown residents a computer science boot camp and ship them off to Silicon Valley to become coders. That to me is just the most ridiculous kind of policy prescription that somehow is, lauded and seen as the way out. No, my question is, how can we make, for people who don't leave Youngstown, for people who don't get college degrees, how can we make cities like Youngstown a place where they can have a dignified life, a place where they can raise a family, a place where they can have even kind of blue collar employment that provides enough for them to have a meaningful life? And that to me is really the question at the heart of the film.
No, it's so interesting because one of the things I thought watching the film was something that you just referred to. Is I've been to 32 countries. I've been to a lot of very, very poor countries. I've, had meals with people in homes that would be considered, rock bottom poor in most places in North America. And yet there was a father, a mother, often grandparents, they were very, very happy. And so not to head off into cliches about how you don't need money to be happy, it was the people there. The children essentially had a protective shell around them still by virtue of having parents. The boys had fathers teaching them what to do. The girls had fathers to protect them. They had a nurturing mother present in the home who wasn't constantly distracted, was simply just trying to scrape together enough to get them through the next day. And even when they were doing that, they were in it together. They were a unit. And watching this, that was so noticeably absent. And so I was wondering, I read Tucker Carlson's book, Ship of Fools, when it came out last year, and I noticed that he, to the horror of some on the right, actually said that Elizabeth Warren's book, The Two-Income Trap, is one of the best books he's ever read. I was at the National Conservatism Conference in Washington, D.C., where he spoke last summer, and he again made a pitch for that book and basically said, this book is better than anything I've read coming from the social conservative think tanks in 30 years, because what it's all about is if a father can't raise enough money to sustain his family, the father loses his dignity. When he loses his dignity, he starts to self-medicate with drugs, with drink. He becomes an awful person. He can become his family's worst problem instead of their greatest protector. And then once the father goes, all the data indicates the family starts to fall apart. And so it's in our day of talking about the empowerment of women, which is a good thing, it's somehow not as acceptable to talk about what these shifting economic structures have done to fathers and what that consequently has done to the families. What were your thoughts looking at those family structures about the importance of fathers and the gap and the void they've left behind?
Yeah, I mean, I think there's again a kind of huge schism and chasm between the elite discourse and the actual experience of people in the lower class. And it's kind of fashionable to say, amongst kind of the wealthy or the kind of cultural elites, to say, well, anyone, a single mom is empowering, it's liberating, it's great. They can do everything. You don't need a man. And yeah, if you are a kind of multimillionaire, pop star, you could probably adopt a child and be a single parent and be fine, because you could essentially use the market to shore up all of those missing social pieces through kind of hired help. But if you are, in Memphis and living in a public housing project, and you're a single mother with 3 kids and no high school diploma, your life options are so severely limited that it really is an absolute tragedy. And if you talk to the people who've experienced that, the first thing that they'll say, oftentimes kind of with tears welling up in their eyes, is, I want my kids to get married before having their own kids. I want them to graduate high school. I want them to have a good man, a good husband, a good father for their kids, because I did it this way, and I can see that the damage that is done. And in a weird way, a lot of the folks I talk to in the film are not really political. They're not partisan. That's really not in their kind of interest. But they're saying the things that conservatives have been saying for a long time, from a place of experience. And I think that is really tremendously valuable. And I think that, especially if you're at that low, kind of lower end of the education spectrum or the income spectrum, having 2 parents is the kind of the ticket out of poverty, period, full stop. That's it. And I think it's really interesting. Going back to your point about having traveled in other countries, I did the same as a filmmaker, many places around the world. And we're in this really bizarre place in the United States where I'm kind of honestly borrowing the language and conceptualization from some of my friends on the left, where we have an economy, but we don't have a society. It's very strange. We have, even the poorest people, if you're at the kind of bottom quintile, your average, the kind of bottom quintile in the United States is equivalent to the median income in many of the poor European countries. So the people who are poor in the United States have a middle-class income in Southern European countries. So we can't say that it's just economic poverty that's happening. But what we don't have is, we don't have a kind of stable, structured, kind of diffused society. We don't have the kind of institutions of civil society, of family, of local community, of kind of bottom-up political organizing that poor European countries have, and even some third world countries have, frankly. And again, I think this plays into Tucker Carlson's point, is as kind of conservatives, we've doubled and tripled and quadrupled down on the kind of free market, which is great, support it, awesome. So to the point, though, where we've kind of pushed that kind of GDP, we've pushed the median income to an extraordinary place. But what we've lost sight of is that, meanwhile, we've shredded the social institutions, especially at the bottom. And I think a true conservatism has to balance the kind of free market kind of protections and impulses and policies with a honestly equal or greater concern for that society portion, that kind of social fabric portion that I'm afraid that we've really lost sight of in the past half century.
It's so interesting because your documentary was implicitly critical of both sides of the spectrum, because conservatives no longer know what they're conserving, because you can conserve income, as you say, but if I watch your film, they don't have anything left, and what they want is not what they have. And then on the left, you often have this, well, we can't judge anybody's behavior because we want people to be liberated. Well, it's liberated from what and to what? And your film shows what they're being liberated from and what they ended up once they were liberated. So both sides are equally to blame in the way they frame the problem. And I was thinking a lot, actually, actually, watching your film, and you just mentioned you're going to borrow some terminology from your friends on the left, and I'll do the same, is the concept of privilege. I find that one of my larger problems with the left is not that I disagree with some of their framing, it's they're screaming in the wrong direction, like they're barking up the wrong tree. Like watching your documentary, I was really reminded again that I am a tremendously privileged person. Not because of my skin color. My grandparents, fled post-war the Netherlands after, it was sort of ruined. They couldn't find a place to live because it had been so devastated. So like thousands of other people, they picked up and they moved to North America. They had no money. They had to, borrow money from a train conductor to buy food on the way across the country. But it's because that sacrifice was for their kids, and their kids sacrificed for the next generation, which would be my generation, and I had those two parents. That has made me an immensely privileged person. The fact that I had a mother and a father who taught me how to work, that taught me, how to treat women, how to live my life, like all of these basic skills. When I was watching your documentary, the fellow at the end that the film sort of wraps up with, who has made this decision to stay with his wife as they have their second child, and so determined to give his child what his father hadn't been around to give him. It struck me that as he's breaking the cycle, that what we're seeing is a loss of cultural knowledge. It's not being passed down. Young men aren't being taught how to live, how to work, how to act. So many of the things that they do to women in their interactions are because they were raised on digital porn, not a good father. Women are repeating the same mistakes of their mothers, and we just have this entire mess. Is there a way we can start framing the conversation in terms of privilege, of saying, you know what, conservatives, it's very easy for us to say, pull yourself up by your bootstraps. And here's where I'll borrow more left-wing language. I was born with bootstraps, and that's because I was born into a family with two loving parents. So that sort of put me on a path to success. I would have had to screw up a lot of things in order to not make it. In other words, right? The deck was stacked in my favor. You look at these people, their social safety net is so thin that like it's one wrong step and a steep drop to the bottom, at which there's despair, addiction, and a self-perpetuating cycle.
Yeah, that's right. I think the privilege discourse is really something that is remarkable, because the kind of cultural elites that have kind of formed this discourse and use it not as a call to greater responsibility or to kind of a noblesse oblige, or they use it as a weapon to attack people and humiliate people and shame people for their skin color, which is so bizarre and awful and just kind of cringeworthy. And privilege is a kind of multidimensional calculation. I have privilege, and we both do, probably in part because of our kind of European heritage. There's some truth to that for sure. In part because we are highly educated, had two-parent households. I don't know about you. I grew up in a fairly affluent household. My father wasn't privileged. My father came from nothing. He lived in a shanty town with no running water, no electricity after World War II in Italy. And took a third-class bottom of the boat ticket to the United States. I mean, it's like, and his father, my grandfather, went through fifth grade. That's it, was a tailor. And then his father was a feudal serf. I mean, it's like, so privilege is complex. It's not kind of innate or inborn. It's not a racial category. The people in Youngstown, Ohio, that are on the kind of white working class in Youngstown aren't privileged. In fact, they're just as kind of unprivileged as their counterparts in Memphis and Stockton. So you have to look at privilege from a number of different places. It's class, it's education, it's race, it's in some cases gender, it's upbringing, it's family structure, it's all these things. And we've unfortunately kind of narrowed it to only one category. And then it becomes this really destructive and kind of divisive racial issue, when I think there is a kind of argument to be made for privilege, and people who are privileged from all of those different factors should try to share the kind of knowledge and blessing and structures of privilege with others. And what that would look like is to say to as a society, to say, these things work These things will give your kids privilege, regardless of your race, regardless of your gender. It is having a two-parent household. It's having at least one person in the household working full-time throughout the year. It's keeping your kids in the kind of education, finding the best education you possibly can for your kids. It's having a society that is organized in a way that perpetuates the common good. And it's designing policies that can empower people even at the bottom. It's a whole series of things. And instead, we have this really disgusting what's the word? This kind of deterministic rhetoric where if you are this, you will be this way forever. Mm-hmm. If you are this, you're a victim. And society owes you, and it's up to us to provide the thing that was stolen from you. It's really this kind of brutal zero-sum deterministic language. And I think that the making the film and spending so much time in these communities shows me that the people that are actually stripped of all privileges, of all different racial backgrounds, have an idea of the good. They have a kind of innate sense of what they want. They want a family. They want meaningful work. They want a society that works. They want safety. They want education. They want a future for their kids. We have to secure that for them. And the kind of privilege that I have, and you might have, I don't know, and others have that are kind of in the policy space or leadership space or corporate space, that's our obligation. Privilege does not require me to say I'm ashamed of who I am. Privilege requires me to have some obligation for others. And that's how I think we need to change the kind of discourse around it.
Yeah, and one of the other things that I've really been wanting to ask you, because after you spent all this time in those communities, one of the things we've discussed a lot on this show, I recently spoke with Mary Aberstadt on this subject extensively, is a lot of the policies that we see being implemented in Hungary right now that very much interest me. And one of the difficulties on the American right, and I've had discussions with pro-life and pro-family leaders about this particular topic on Hungary-style policies, is right away people say, welfare systems, social welfare state, et cetera, et cetera. A welfare state replaces the father, attempts to replace the family, and I think is partially responsible for what we see happening in those cities that you show in your film, is that the state has attempted to replace the family, and it's brought nothing but misery. What Orban is trying to do in Hungary is to essentially use financial incentives to sort of like prod people in the right direction, right? When he has policies that essentially says there's massive tax breaks if you get married. We're going to incentivize marriage. We're going to disincentivize divorce. We're going to start, maternity benefits while you're still pregnant to discourage abortion, which has resulted in a plummeting drop in the abortion rate. Your rate of taxation is going to plummet every time you have a child, to the point where now if a woman has her fourth child, she doesn't have to pay income tax for the rest of her life, right?
Is that true?
Yeah.
Oh my God.
And this, it's been put forward. It hasn't passed yet, but Orban runs a tight ship, so it'll pass. And so I don't look at what he's doing as welfare state. It's not replacing the family. What he's doing is providing incentives to make the right decisions that will inevitably make people happier. The divorce rate over there is plummeting. The marriage rate is going up because right now we have a set of financial incentives that often discourage families, that discourage the father from staying in the home. Sometimes that encourage out of wedlock birth, because if you're out of money and the government's going to give you a big fat check every month, which I don't necessarily oppose. If they need it, they need it. But it's still encouraging behavior that's perpetuating the problem rather than reducing it. And so I've struggled talking to fellow conservatives to differentiate between government incentives and intervention versus a welfare state, one of which I oppose and is part of the problem, and the other of which I think in the 3 or 4 countries that's being tried is actually contributing to a renaissance of family life. What are your thoughts on all of that, if I can just dump that all on your lap for a moment?
No, and I'm glad you did. Yeah, I've been thinking a lot about that, and I kind of sidestepped it in the film.
Yes,
in the sense that I don't make policy prescriptions. I don't say this is how we should restructure things, because I kind of realize like the film is about the people. It's about what they can do. It's not really about policy, and any kind of 2 minutes of narration saying this is the solution will be kind of too narrow. But I've been thinking a lot about it though on the side as kind of a more intellectual question. And I think the kind of heart of what you're saying is true, is that conservatives have basically said we need to kill big government. We need to get rid of the welfare state. We need to defund it. I mean, that's been the kind of rhetoric since really Barry Goldwater in 1964. And it's now what, 60 years later? I mean, it's 75 years later, whatever the math is. It's still early in the morning for me, but we've tried it.
Yeah.
That was Reagan's rhetoric. That was the Bush. And it's like, it never works. We've never been able to do it. In fact, conservative presidents in the United States have expanded the welfare state, famously with George W. Bush. So,
well, it's because it's like, we as you say, we get rid of all that stuff, and then what? And the conservatives never seem to have a and then what?
Well, they're kind of been captured by this libertarian idea that once you get rid of it, you can get rid of it and everything will change. And maybe that's possible, but politically, it's not feasible to get rid of it. That's just a fact. So I think what I would think is the real next step for conservatives is to say the Reagan rhetoric of getting rid of it and demonizing the kind of welfare queen or whatever. That's not going to work. It hasn't worked in the past. It's not going to work in the future. So what we need to do is we need to offer the working class a better deal than the welfare state of today. And I think part of it is basically saying we want to help your family. We want to incentivize family. We want to provide a dignified life. And my idea that I'm kind of toying with and trying to work out the structure this coming year is how can you, in essence, redistribute the welfare state? Because one of the problems with the welfare state is that it is kind of a top-down, micromanaged, social science-based intervention, where large portions of the money actually get sucked up by the bureaucracy. So, like famously, the kind of middle-aged women with master's degree in social work that are getting the $80,000 a year salary, but the person who's actually poor is getting $3,000 a year or whatever. How can you basically make a deal with saying, hey, we're going to make a deal with a broad coalition spanning the left and the right. The right gets, we're going to get rid of the bureaucracy and the administrative state. We're going to downsize it drastically. And the people, let's say kind of more left-leaning, say, but we're going to give you the money, people in that are actually in the kind of working class, and do it maybe as a kind of wage supplement where you can say, if you're a father that's working full-time at a kind of high school education job and you're making $18 an hour, what if we provided a kind of negative income tax that then made your wage $25 an hour? So incentivizing work, incentivizing family, helping people escape that two-income trap, and making the kind of service sector work the financial equivalent of the old industrial sector work. And we can do it. I think that there's a way that we can do it that actually achieves the kind of conservative goals of decentralizing power away from the bureaucracy. But also, I think what needs to be a core conservative kind of campaign to provide the kind of structure and foundation and incentives for a dignified working class life. I think that's a conservative goal, and that we should reorient our policies accordingly.
No, that sounds phenomenal, and I'd love to have you on again once you've you sort of hammered through a lot of that, because I've seen these sorts of policies work in other countries. America is like 50 countries in one country. There's no one size fits all, which is what conservatism is all about anyways. But just the concept is interesting. And the final point that I wanted to briefly discuss with you is your sort of conclusion, which I was not expecting, to be honest. When you start to talk about the phenomenal success these Christian men's ministries have had, one of them had 80% success rate in pulling men out of addiction and sort of putting their lives back together. And at one point in the film, it stuck out to me. You said this is deep human to human work. But because we're dealing with humans, this is the only thing that's truly effective. And it was interesting because I had thought partway through the film, as I was kind of trying to wrap my head around what might work, it's the policy brain, what might work to help these people's lives. I thought, like what these people need is a miracle. And then we get towards the end of the film, I'm like, okay, so we've got pastors who represent a God capable of them. It does seem fitting that the film would end this way. And so many of the social fabric, like shredding that you looked at in all these different cities, these resembled communities that, they just didn't have a soul anymore. And there was no animating force to it. And that's what was missing. So maybe just share with us what you found about the impact of faith-based organizations, about people putting their lives back together. Because it didn't come out of nowhere once I, went back and I was kind of piecing the film together in my head to write the review. But I was certainly surprised when suddenly that was the conclusion of your film. And you say in the film that you didn't expect to make a film about how faith-based ministries and return to faith is one of the key things to reanimate these communities. But there it was.
Yeah, I really didn't. I mean, it was a huge surprise to me, and frankly, to be perfectly honest with you, I resisted it for a while. I said, well, there's got to be a policy solution, there's an economic solution, and then it just kind of kept punching me in the face over and over. When what I saw in all three cities, again, across the three dominant racial groups, three geographic regions, different places, it just kept hitting me over and over, like, oh wow, there's this group over here, they seem to be doing a good job. I'll tag along going to church with this character, or finding out what's happening with the community here. And it just over and over, to the point where it was overwhelming and I couldn't ignore it anymore, that the most successful groups that were helping people in real life were not government bureaucracies, were not even kind of jobs or corporations, but it was faith-based organizations that were kind of like storefront churches, evangelical churches, tiny Catholic parishes, these really grassroots, the Black churches in South Memphis that have been kind of the root and cornerstone of these communities. These were the places that actually turned people's lives around. And in a lot of cases, it's really naive to think if you give somebody money, their life is going to get better. I know a lot of perfectly miserable, wealthy people. I mean, it's not a guarantee. It's good, all things being equal. I'd rather have people being wealthy than poor. But what you realize is that in these communities, people are suffering from really deep traumas and social pathologies and interpersonal struggles and family breakdown and no sense of purpose or meaning that has been just and kind of taken away from them, really stripped from these communities, which I think is a tragedy and not their fault. And the churches were the only organizations that I saw that consistently restored a sense of meaning, restored a sense of structure, restored a sense of moral order, restored a sense of direction for people, and actually help people from the inside out say, what's going on in your life? How can we get you back with your kids? Let's help pay off your back child support. Let's help kind of reconnect with your girlfriend or your baby mama. We know a guy that runs a warehouse. Even though you have a criminal record, you could probably get a job running a forklift there. They were really trying to truly help people. And I think the difference is that it started from a place of, this is the right thing to do. That's very powerful. And our social science bureaucracy can never tell you this is right and this is wrong. All they can do is say, this is correlated with better outcomes, which doesn't have the same force. No. And they can also then say, in a personal way, what's going on with you? What's happening? And then they can say, I went through the same thing. This person went through the same thing. And I'm here to help you, not because I'm paid to work 9 to 5 at the Department of Child Support and Human Welfare, but because I grew up in this community. I know your cousin, I know your brother, I visited your uncle in jail, and come with me, I can actually change your life. And again, it's not something that I sought out to the story to tell, but that's the story that exists. That's the story that works. That's the story that functions at a very high level. And I think that whatever your faith if you're an atheist or an evangelical or a Hindu or whatever your faith background is, I think that you need to recognize the kind of the secular consequences of these faith-based approaches. And I think that they're a really essential, and I think that part of the agenda, maybe not explicitly a policy agenda, has to be to revitalize the faith communities, the faith institutions in working class communities.
Final question, because I've kept you even longer than we expected. Where can everybody find your film, which I do highly recommend?
Yeah, well, all of the members of your audience can actually watch the film for free. It's available at the PBS app. So if you have the PBS app on your smart TV, you can watch it there. It's available for purchase on Amazon. But if you want to watch it for free in the full-length film, it's available at americalostfilm.com/premiere. That's americalostfilm.com/premiere. You can watch the trailer, enter your email, and watch it for free.
Thank you so much for taking the time to talk to us about all this.
Thank you. It's great to talk to you.
Ladies and gentlemen, that was my conversation with Christopher Ruffo of the Discovery Institute's Center on Wealth and Poverty. I do highly recommend his documentary, America Lost. If you want to subscribe to this podcast, please head over to lifesitenews.com. Check out the podcast tab. You can subscribe to the show. Check out past shows. We've been having phenomenal conversations like this every single week. And you would, I think, get a lot out of those conversations if you want to understand how our culture got to this point and what we can do to begin the long road towards recovery. Again, thank you so much for joining us this week, and we do hope you'll join us again next week.